I don't think I'll ever forget the day I received the invitation. Not because it was some grand moment or because it was filled with excitement. No, it was the exact opposite. It hit me like a punch to the gut, sharp and unexpected. The envelope was a work of art. Thick, embossed, shiny gold lettering spelling out the name of the prestigious venue where Paige's film was premiering. The scent of expensive paper wafted out when I opened it, but what I found inside made my stomach twist. The invitation wasn't even addressed to me, not really. It was addressed to Miss Sloane River, not Rivers, not even a typo. River, singular, as though I was a forgotten afterthought. The extra S was clearly omitted on purpose. It was almost like they'd gone out of their way to minimize my presence. My mind raced as I stared at the card. I was invited to the gala, yes, but only just. A formality invite. Something that said, "We don't really care about you being here, but we have to extend an invitation because of who you are." A token gesture. Nothing more. I sank into the armchair in my stark, utilitarian apartment. The walls were lined with tactical folders, scattered with papers I had yet to review, projects I had put off. It was all familiar, the work that never stopped, the quiet solitude of my space. My hands shook slightly as I traced the embossed letters on the card. Miss Sloane River. I wanted to laugh, or maybe cry. Both felt like the appropriate reactions, but I didn't do either. I'd learned long ago not to let the world see that side of me, especially when it came to my family. I dialed Jenna's number, hoping she'd be able to provide some clarity. Jenna and I had worked together in military intelligence before I left it behind. She was one of the few who knew how deeply I felt about this constant tug-of-war with my family. She answered on the second ring, her voice clipped, professional. "Jenna, I need you to confirm something," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my chest was tight. "Was this invitation a mistake? I think they misspelled my name." There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Sloane, that's not a mistake. Paige did it on purpose." The words hit harder than I expected. "What do you mean? She actually erased me like that?" "Yeah," Jenna replied. "It's subtle, but it's not accidental. She's always done this to you, left you out, and you keep letting it slide." I pressed the phone against my ear, squeezing my eyes shut. The weight of years of being sidelined, minimized, it all rushed back to me in that moment. But I've always been there for her. I've done everything she asked of me. "Yeah," Jenna said, voice soft but firm. "Maybe it's time you stopped." I let out a long breath. Was I really going to let this affect me? Could I afford to be hurt by something so small, so petty? Probably not. But it didn't stop the frustration from building. The sense that once again, my family had brushed me aside. I stared at the invitation again. The gold lettering, the glaring omission of my name. I felt something stir inside me, a slow burn of anger, a realization that maybe it was time for me to stop making myself invisible for them. Time to finally stop pretending that it didn't matter. But I wasn't ready to face that yet. I wasn't ready to confront how deeply their disregard for me had settled into my bones, how long I'd let it slide. I looked at the invitation one last time, my thumb tracing the edges of the card, the embossed river. My heart hardened, but I said nothing. Instead, I grabbed my keys, stood up, and left the apartment. The world was still waiting for me to be the good soldier, the dutiful sister. But maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. I wasn't ready to let them control me anymore. And the premiere? I wasn't sure if I was going to it, or if I could face her in that world where I was nothing more than a formality. But one thing was certain. Things were about to shift. I arrived at the downtown theater early, my boots echoing in the vast, hollow space as I stepped onto the red carpet. It was designed for someone else, not me. Someone with a name that was meant to shine in the spotlight. As I moved forward, I felt out of place, like an intruder in someone else's world. The walls were angular, cold, and clinical, as if the building itself had been crafted for prestige rather than comfort. The theater was everything Paige had worked for, everything she wanted, perfectly polished, sharp-edged, carefully designed. I could practically hear her in the back of my mind, giving instructions, organizing the chaos, fitting herself into the glamorous box she had built. Everything about this place screamed her success, but not mine, not us, not family. I was here because it was required, because even though I wasn't good enough to be included on the invitation, I still had to show up. The formality of it all. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out. A quick glance revealed a text from Jenna. "Don't let them diminish you." I chuckled darkly to myself, stuffing the phone back into my jacket pocket. I didn't need her reminder. I knew exactly how they saw me. They always had. It was just easier to ignore the sting. The glass doors opened as I approached, and I stepped inside, immediately struck by the contrast between the glittering, extravagant theater and my own plainness. A woman in a stiff black suit and headset greeted me with a forced smile. "Welcome! The VIP area is upstairs. Your seat is over there," she said, pointing to a row of chairs near the cruise booth. The words, though polite, sounded hollow. Not VIP, not even close. I gave her a polite nod, the sting of her dismissiveness crawling under my skin as I moved past her, heading toward the back of the room. I knew exactly where my seat would be. Not in the front with the glittering faces of Hollywood, not near the stage, not even in the important section. Just behind the scenes, out of sight. Another invisible cog in a machine that didn't need me. As I made my way to the seat, I spotted Elaine, my stepmother, at the other end of the room. She was wrapped in a designer gown, sitting with her delicate glass of champagne, talking animatedly with a few of Paige's high-profile colleagues. As I approached, she glanced over at me, and her smile widened. "Ah, Sloane, dear, so glad you could make it," she said in that sickly sweet tone she always used when she was pretending to be nice. "I trust you're doing well?" "I'm good," I replied, forcing a smile of my own, though it didn't reach my eyes. She motioned toward the back, her words practically dripping with condescension. "The stylists are over there if you want to help them with inventory. You know, the little things that keep everything running smoothly." I felt my jaw clench. Inventory. She was treating me like one of the hired hands, like someone who existed to do menial tasks, not someone who had spent her entire career saving lives. But no, I wasn't going to fight it. Not here. Not yet. I nodded, my stomach turning as I walked toward the backstage area, my footsteps echoing louder than I'd like. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of Paige on the stage, her radiant smile a stark contrast to the tension knotting in my chest. She was rehearsing her speech, perfectly poised, lost in her own world. I could see the designers adjusting her gown, people fawning over her every move. She didn't notice me, of course. She didn't even acknowledge my presence. She didn't have to. I wasn't part of her world anymore. I tried to remind myself that I didn't care. It was just a premiere. Just another night in her world where I didn't belong. But the more I told myself that, the more the bitterness grew, sharp and painful. I passed the stylists, who barely glanced at me as I took my seat in the back row. They were too absorbed in their task, running around in their own whirlwind of chaos, unbothered by my existence, just like the rest of them. I pulled my coat tighter around myself, my mind racing with all the ways I'd been pushed aside, made invisible. They had everything. The fame, the accolades, the love and admiration of people who actually mattered. I had the scraps, the leftovers. I was just the sister who showed up when they needed me. But tonight, I wasn't going to let it slide. Not anymore. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need to fit into the world they had made. But damn it still hurt. It always would. The thought lingered as I sat there in the darkened corner of the theater, my mind consumed by the realization that no matter how hard I tried to be the perfect family member, I would always be relegated to the background. The lights dimmed and the crowd's murmurs faded as the pre-screening montage started. A slideshow of photos from Paige's childhood, the memories carefully curated for the event. Laughter filled the air as the audience watched images of her and our parents captured at family vacations, holidays, and milestones. It was supposed to be a tribute, a loving nod to her journey, her life, but as the montage played, something felt wrong. I leaned forward in my seat, my eyes locked on the screen. There, in the corner of one of the photos, was me, barely visible, a shadow in the background, a younger version of myself standing with the family, but so far from the center that it almost felt like I wasn't really there, a small blur in a sea of people who mattered more. I tried to breathe through it, but it was hard. It wasn't just the way they minimized me in every moment. It was how they had intentionally erased me from their history, and now this was a reminder that I was never truly part of their story. The room was silent as the montage ended. Paige stood up from her seat, looking every bit the perfect starlet, her designer gown shimmering under the spotlight. She smiled that bright, practiced smile that looked like it had been perfected for the cameras. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice smooth, confident, too perfect. "This is a huge moment in my life, and I want to acknowledge all the amazing people who helped me get here." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, lingering just a little too long on a few faces in the front row. I watched, my heart tightening in my chest as she started to list off names. There were the usual suspects: agents, producers, directors, friends who had always believed in her. She thanked the stylists, the photographers, the people who worked behind the scenes. And as I sat there, waiting for her to finally say something about the people who truly mattered to her, the ones who had always supported her, I realized she wasn't going to mention me. Not a word. The silence stretched, unbearable in its weight. I glanced around the room, feeling every pair of eyes in the theater. Did anyone else notice? Did anyone else feel that tension, that small stab of coldness in the air? Finally, Paige turned her gaze to the audience, her voice crisp and clear. And a special thank you to my amazing partner, Maury, for all your support and encouragement. And to everyone else who helped make this possible, you know who you are. She smiled, and the room erupted into applause. But I wasn't clapping. My hands were frozen in my lap, clenched into fists that I couldn't release. Her words stung, but it was the omission, the fact that I was nowhere in her speech, that burned the most. And then it happened. A man I didn't recognize walked over to me. He was wearing a sharp suit, a producer or someone important, no doubt, and extended his hand toward me. "Sloan, right?" he asked, a polite, almost patronizing smile on his face. "Yes," I said, my voice cool despite the rage bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm Jack," he said, shaking my hand. "Elaine introduced me to you earlier as Paige's sister, right? You've done some work in logistics?" I blinked, surprised at how easily the word logistics slid off his tongue, like it was meant to define me, to limit me to something small. I took a breath, the urge to correct him clawing at my throat. "No," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "I ran operational planning at Langley, but yes, logistics is one way to describe it." I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, and the man's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "I guess spreadsheets?" His attempt at humor fell flat, and he quickly backed away, as if realizing he had made a mistake. I didn't speak again. I didn't have to. The damage had been done. Paige's disregard, her public erasure of me, had been validated by everyone in the room, even by someone who had no idea who I was. I felt small, invisible. But more than that, I felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How could she do this? How could she be so cold, so careful in her manipulation? I had given so much for her, for this family, and here I was, a shadow in the background, a name she barely recognized, much less acknowledged. The applause died down and Paige took the stage again. She smiled, thanked her team, her friends. The world saw her as this beautiful, brilliant, perfect woman. I couldn't even get a simple thank you for everything I'd done. As the screening began, I sat back in my seat, my hands still trembling, trying to steady my breath. But nothing could calm the fire inside me, the rising anger, the slow realization that I wasn't going to let her do this to me anymore. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. This was her choice, and she would feel it. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let her pretend I didn't exist anymore. Not after everything I had done for her, not after everything I had sacrificed. The night was far from over, and so was the reckoning. I wasn't done with her, not yet. During the intermission, when the hum of chatter filled the theater, I slipped out of my seat and wandered backstage, needing a few moments away from the crowd. The tension was thick, and the air felt heavy with expectations, the kind of expectations I'd never quite measured up to. Paige's world was nothing but sharp edges and polished surfaces, a place where I had never been invited to stay. I found myself wandering deeper into the bowels of the theater, the backstage area dim and cluttered with costumes and props. The smell of old fabric and paint mixed with the crisp air that blew in from the backstage vents. I didn't have any real reason to be back here, but something tugged at me, a pull to explore the hidden spaces that no one bothered with. I stopped in front of a dusty cabinet that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The label on the drawer said, "Paige's Childhood Junk." I stared at it for a long moment. Childhood junk? I could hear Paige's voice in my head, the same one she'd used to dismiss anything less than perfect. Her world was always so clean, so organized, so curated. I opened the drawer without thinking, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled it out. Inside were old keepsakes, things long forgotten, childhood awards, photos, and, strangely, a few random objects. At first it seemed like everything I expected, but then something caught my eye. Tucked at the bottom of the drawer under a pile of worn notebooks was an old compass pendant, one I hadn't seen in years. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled it out. The silver chain tarnished, but the compass still intact. I had lost this pendant at camp when I was 11, the last gift my biological mother had ever given me. I could barely remember the moment I had lost it, but it had haunted me for years. It was the kind of thing that felt significant. And now, here it was, tucked away in Paige's drawer, buried beneath everything else she deemed important. I turned it over in my hands, the memories flooding back. The campfire, my mom's soft voice as she fastened it around my neck. It had been a symbol of her love, a piece of her that I had carried with me for years until one careless moment had taken it from me. But why was it here? I didn't know whether to feel angry or heartbroken. Was it just forgotten? Or had it been hidden away on purpose? I pushed that thought aside and reached further into the drawer, hoping for some sort of explanation. There, beneath the clutter, was a folded piece of paper. I pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. It was a mission draft, one I had written back when I was still with the agency years ago. The title read, Operation Warsaw, Civilian Protection. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized it. It was the mission where my analysis had led to the prevention of a bombing that could have killed hundreds of civilians. It was one of my proudest moments, one I had poured myself into, late nights at the base, poring over data, following every lead until we'd identified the plot and stopped it before it could unfold. I had never submitted the report. The higher-ups had taken it from me, and I'd assumed it had been buried with the rest of my work. But there it was, sitting in Paige's drawer, annotated in green ink, never sent. My heart pounded as I read the notes scrawled across the page, the familiar handwriting of Captain J. Maury. This saved 3 lives. The words seemed to jump off the paper, and I felt a strange mix of pride and confusion. Why is this here? I thought again. Why would Paige have kept this? And then, as I continued reading, the weight of it all hit me. It wasn't just the compass or the mission draft that had been tucked away, it was everything. My life, my accomplishments, my sacrifices, all hidden in the corners of her world, curated away, tucked into the shadows like something too messy, too inconvenient for her to deal with. It was deliberate. They hadn't forgotten me. They had stored me away as though I was nothing more than clutter. I closed the drawer gently, the heaviness of the moment settling in my chest. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Disappointment? Sadness? Maybe all of it. I stood there for a long time, holding the compass in one hand, the mission draft in the other. I thought of the years I had spent trying to fit into their world, trying to make myself visible, and I wondered if they even realized what they had done. How long had they been erasing me? How long had I allowed them to? The truth was, they hadn't forgotten me. They had just chosen to ignore me, to leave me on the edges of their lives while they built their perfect little world. And now, here I was, holding the remnants of what they thought they could bury. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with all of it. The pendant, the report, the bitterness that was starting to swell inside me. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let them get away with it anymore. I slipped the pendant into my pocket and walked out of the room, my mind racing with possibilities. The night wasn't over, and neither was I. It was time for me to make my presence known, for the last time. The night dragged on, the film screening blending into the banquet that followed. My seat remained at the back, tucked away in the shadows, the farthest point from the glitz and glam that I wasn't meant to be a part of. The faint murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter that filled the air couldn't drown out the growing weight on my chest. Every interaction, every smile that wasn't mine, felt like an affirmation of what I already knew. I wasn't truly part of their world. Not anymore. Not in the way they wanted me to be. But as the night wore on, I found myself slipping out of the banquet hall once more, needing a moment of quiet to gather my thoughts. I wandered down an empty hallway, the velvet carpet beneath my feet muffling my steps. At the far end of the corridor, I found a small office, one of the many that had been set aside for the event, and I stepped inside. The dim lighting felt like a balm, the quiet and solitude comforting for the first time all evening. I walked over to the desk, half expecting it to be filled with more paperwork or promotional materials for the event. Instead, I found something unexpected, a small pile of documents, neatly stacked, waiting for someone to look through them. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped through the papers, the familiar professional notes and reports catching my attention. I paused at one paper, my heart racing as I recognized the details. It was my field report. I stared at the document for a long moment. It was the same mission draft I had seen earlier, the one that had been buried in Paige's drawer. The mission that had prevented the bombing in Warsaw. The one I had worked on alone, in the dead of night when the rest of the world slept. The one I had thought would never see the light of day. But here it was, printed out, reviewed, and annotated, in Maury's handwriting again. The words jumped off the page like they were alive. This saved 3 lives. I felt a rush of heat. The satisfaction of knowing my work had made a difference had truly mattered. I had always done my best to make sure my contributions counted, even when no one noticed, even when they ignored me. I skimmed the rest of the report, my heart pounding faster with each line. This wasn't just a confirmation of my abilities. This was proof. Proof that I wasn't invisible. Proof that my work had been seen. Someone had recognized it. My thoughts flickered back to the drawer at the theater, to the moment I'd held the compass pendant in my hand. The way I'd felt like a forgotten ghost, erased from Paige's world, buried beneath the layers of her curated success. But this was different. I wasn't forgotten everywhere. I wasn't invisible to everyone. Maury had recognized me, and not just that. He had kept track of my work, had respected it enough to keep it. And now, years later, I was seeing the proof of it. This wasn't some meaningless gesture. This wasn't just a line in a report to him. This had mattered. I picked up my phone, instinctively dialing Jenna. When she picked up, I didn't even let her say hello. Maury knew about the report. All this time he kept it. He knew what I did. Jenna's voice was quiet but understanding. I told you, Sloan, you're not forgotten by everyone. But why didn't they ever acknowledge it? I asked, my voice catching. Why didn't Paige ever recognize me? Why keep me in the background? Because it's easier to keep you there, Jenna said softly. When you're in the shadows, it's easy for them to pretend you don't matter. I rubbed my forehead, a deep sigh escaping my lips. I've spent my whole life trying to prove I matter, trying to show them that I'm not just the backup plan, that I'm not just the person who cleans up after everyone else's mess. And you do matter, Sloan, Jenna said firmly. You've always mattered. And now, at least you know it wasn't you they were ignoring. It was their way of protecting their fragile little world. I swallowed, staring down at the report, the weight of it pressing into me like a realization. Their fragile little world. I wasn't a part of it, and I was finally okay with that. I took a steadying breath, my fingers moving to gather the papers. I had everything I needed. Not the recognition I'd always wanted, but the validation I didn't even realize I had been seeking. You were right, Jenna, I said, my voice finally steady. I'm done proving myself to them. You're done? Yeah, I said with a deep breath. I'm done. I hung up the phone, still holding the report. It was time to go back, not to take the seat they wanted to give me, not to sit in the shadows. I walked back toward the banquet hall, but this time I wasn't walking in with my head down. I wasn't invisible anymore. I had something they couldn't erase, something that proved I had always been more than they had ever let me be. As I entered the hall, the familiar faces of the crowd greeted me, but this time I stood taller. This time I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their recognition. I had my own recognition. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. It wasn't about making them see me. It was about making me see myself. And I had. Finally. The post-premiere banquet was a cacophony of laughter and clinking glasses, a sea of faces all centered around one thing: Paige. Every conversation was about her film, her success, her dazzling ascent into the world of high society. The room seemed to hum with energy, but for me, it felt like I was standing on the edge of something too vast to grasp. I wasn't in the spotlight. I wasn't invited into the intimate circle of the Hollywood elite, even though I was there by obligation. I had already made peace with that. I was just the background again, the formality, the sibling who would remain forgotten as long as she remained a footnote in Paige's narrative. I didn't care. Not anymore. I poured myself a glass of wine and took a quiet sip, leaning against the bar, my gaze wandering over the crowd. Paige was standing by the stage, laughing with a small group of producers. I could barely make out her words, but I could see how they hung on her every syllable, how they made her the center of attention. Elaine, my stepmother, was chatting up some wealthy guests nearby, her voice lilting and syrupy, but her eyes darted back to me with barely concealed disdain every now and then. She hadn't even bothered to greet me properly. But I didn't care. The silence of my presence, my invisibility, was something I had come to accept over the years. Tonight was no different. I was the quiet observer, a fly on the wall in the world they had created for themselves. And then, just as I was beginning to let the tension slip away, I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't need to look up. I already knew who it was. Maury, the decorated NATO commander, a man who had recognized my work before anyone else ever did. He had been quiet and unassuming, but when the time came for the military operation in Warsaw, it was his voice that had found my report. His attention had turned to me, and it had meant more than any of the hollow words I'd ever received from my family. He walked up beside me, his movements confident yet deliberate, his sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on me. The silence between us was comfortable, familiar even. His presence didn't demand attention, but somehow it held power. "Analyst Rivers," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a kind of respect. I turned toward him, surprised but not startled. "Captain Maury," I replied with a nod. I hadn't expected him to approach me here of all places. "You're not mingling with the others?" He gave a soft chuckle. "I'd rather be speaking with someone who actually knows how to read data, rather than pretending to be impressed with celebrity talk." I smirked. "You're not much for the glamour, huh?" "Glamour's for people who think they're better than the rest of us," he said, his eyes meeting mine with quiet sincerity. "I've never been that person." There was something in the way he looked at me, like he saw me for more than what I was pretending to be. It was comforting, but also disarming. I glanced back toward the crowd, unsure of how to steer the conversation. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that he was talking to me, not her, not the people Paige surrounded herself with. "I'm surprised you even recognized me," I said, my voice quiet. Maury paused, his gaze narrowing slightly as if considering the question. "I didn't just recognize you, Sloan. I remembered your report. I've been asking about it for years. No one knew who wrote it. But when I saw it, I knew the kind of work it took to make that happen." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. My chest tightened, and for a brief moment I couldn't find my voice. You kept track of it?" He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your work saved lives, Sloan. I'm not going to forget that just because someone else decided it wasn't worth acknowledging. Not everyone will forget you." I swallowed, a lump in my throat threatening to choke me. I didn't know what to say. All my life I had struggled to earn the recognition that should have been mine, but I had never expected to get it from someone like Maury, someone whose career had been built on saving lives, someone who didn't have to pretend to be impressed by anyone. Yet here he was, giving me something I never thought I would get from my family, the acknowledgement of my worth. Before I could respond, Maury turned to face the room, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "And yet, you're still here, watching them pretend to be everything they're not," he said quietly, a hint of bitterness in his tone. I followed his gaze, catching sight of Paige as she spoke with some high-profile guests. She was laughing, a radiant, perfect image of success, but she had barely glanced in my direction. I couldn't shake the sting, not after everything I had done for her, not after everything I had given up. "Maybe it's easier to pretend they matter more than the rest of us," I said, my voice low, tinged with a quiet resentment. Maury gave a slight nod, a solemn understanding in his eyes. "Easier doesn't make it right," I exhaled slowly, the weight of everything pressing on me. "I've spent my whole life trying to fit into their world, but no matter how much I give, I'm always going to be an outsider." Maury's gaze softened. "You don't need them to validate you, Sloan." "I don't know if I can stop wanting it," I said, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. "I don't know how to stop wanting them to see me." For a long moment, Maury said nothing. Then quietly, he spoke again. "You can start by seeing yourself, Sloan, and then the rest of the world will follow." His words lingered between us, weighty and true. I didn't know if I believed them, but something inside me cracked open, a small shift in how I saw myself. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us watching the crowd, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that didn't feel like a void. Then Maury did something I hadn't expected. He raised his glass toward me. "Analyst Rivers," he said, his voice formal but sincere. "Thank you for Warsaw. It mattered. You mattered." The room around us seemed to fall away for a moment, leaving just the two of us in that quiet space of mutual respect. I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of validation I hadn't known I needed. "Thank you, Captain," I replied quietly, raising my glass to him in return. And just like that, the spotlight shifted. Not to Paige, not to her perfect world, but to something real. to something that had been hidden for far too long. The evening continued, but for the first time, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt like I mattered, not because of them, but because of what I had done. And for the first time in years, I was okay with that. Paige's world was still there, still shining in its perfect curated light. But I had learned something tonight. I didn't need to fit into it. I didn't need to be part of it. I had my own light, and that was enough. The applause from Maury's acknowledgement still echoed in my ears as I moved through the banquet hall, the clinking of glasses and chatter filling the air. For the first time tonight, I felt steady, like I had finally grounded myself in the truth of who I was, even if that truth had been buried for so long. I wasn't going to let their pretenses affect me anymore, not with Maury's words in my mind. But then I saw her. Paige was standing with a group of her colleagues near the stage, and her gaze finally caught mine as I passed. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might say something, maybe even acknowledge me. But when she saw me, her smile faltered, just for a second before it quickly returned, stiff and insincere. She excused herself from the group and made her way toward me, but there was no warmth in her approach, no real connection, just the cold, calculated steps of someone who had learned to play the game well. "Sloan?" she said, her voice light, almost casual, as if we hadn't just spent the past few hours ignoring each other. "I didn't know you were coming tonight." She glanced at the crowd as though hoping no one had noticed the awkwardness between us. "I didn't know I was coming either," I said, my voice flat. There was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. She straightened her back and forced a smile. "Well, I'm glad you could make it. I hope you're enjoying the event." "Couldn't miss it," I said, my words sharp, biting, though I kept my tone level. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out of this conversation, but I wasn't done. Not this time. "You never acknowledged me tonight," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "Not in the speech, not in the thank yous. I wasn't even a footnote." Her smile faltered again, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms in a defensive posture. "Sloan, come on, it's not like that. You know how this works. I had to thank the people who really made this happen." "Really?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "And who would that be?" Her eyes flickered, but there was no apology in them, just a cold, practiced response. "My team. The people who've been there for me from the beginning. The ones who fit the vibe, right?" I interrupted, the words dripping with sarcasm. "That's what you told me. That I didn't fit. That I wasn't part of the world you built. That it wasn't about money or who you could depend on. It was about who belonged in the circle." Paige's face went stiff, her cheeks flushing with a hint of irritation, but she held her ground. "I'm just trying to make sure everything stays classy. You know how these events go. It's about creating an image I need for my career." She glanced past me toward a few of her industry contacts, making sure the crowd saw her perfectly curated demeanor. "Yeah, I've seen how you create that image," I said, my voice quiet but unwavering. "By erasing the people who actually helped build you up." The silence between us stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Paige's eyes dropped to the floor, her hands tightening at her sides, but she quickly regained composure. She looked back up at me, forcing the smile back into place. "Look, Sloan, I'm sorry if you feel that way, but it wasn't personal," she said, her voice stiff, rehearsed. "I've had to make some hard choices tonight. You know how it is. I couldn't keep everyone in the circle." "It's not how these things work." I stared at her, feeling every ounce of my frustration bubbling up again, but I refused to let her see it. I couldn't show her how much her words stung. "Yeah, I know how it works," I said, my voice low but firm. "You take, and when you're done, you toss the ones who were always there for you out of your life, because they don't look good enough, or maybe because they remind you that you didn't get here on your own." I watched as her smile faltered for a second, but she quickly masked it, stepping back slightly as if creating a little more space between us. "Sloan," she began again, but this time her voice was different. It was colder. "You're not part of this world anymore. You never were. And I can't keep pretending that things are the way they used to be. This is bigger than you or me." I blinked, stunned by the finality in her tone. She wasn't just brushing me aside, she was cutting the ties completely, as though she had never needed me in the first place. "Bigger than us?" I repeated, almost laughing. "You think this is about us? This is about me, Paige. You erased me tonight, not just from the speech, but from your life. And you expect me to keep showing up like I don't matter?" Her gaze hardened, the indifference creeping in. I'm sorry you feel that way, but this is my life now, my career. You don't fit anymore. I'm moving forward. I felt something snap inside me, like a final, invisible thread between us had been severed. The anger that had been building up inside me now had an outlet. I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. You're moving forward? I asked, my voice rising just a little. By cutting out your family? Your own sister? Paige took a step back, her posture stiffening. I don't owe you anything, Sloane, she said, her voice growing colder. You're the one who's made all these sacrifices, but you've never asked for anything in return. I don't need you to guilt trip me. I felt my chest tighten. I never asked for anything, I said softly, staring at her. I never expected anything. But you don't get to tell me I'm invisible, then act like nothing happened. You don't get to erase me and keep pretending I was just a footnote in your life. She shook her head as if tired of this conversation. I don't need this, Sloane. This is over. She turned away from me, heading toward her next group of people, leaving me standing there, the words hanging in the air between us like a final judgment. I stood there for a moment, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the final fracture, the last moment of clarity I needed. I wasn't part of her world, and I never would be again. But I wasn't going to let it define me. I had my own world, my own life, and it was time to stop trying to fit into hers. As the night wore on, the rest of the evening passed in a blur. I was surrounded by the laughter and chatter of people who didn't matter, the emptiness of their words echoing in my ears. I tried to ignore it, tried to push the pain aside, but it wasn't easy. As the event came to a close, I stood on the balcony watching the crowd below. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't a ghost in her life. I was standing here on my own 2 feet, in my own truth, and that truth was enough. 2 days later, I found myself back in my apartment, staring at the envelope that had arrived in the mail. The address was familiar, but the handwriting was not. The thick, cream-colored paper had been carefully folded and sealed, the edges just slightly frayed, as though it had been handled with more care than a letter from anyone else in my family. I didn't need to look at the return address. I knew who it was from. It was from my father. I hadn't heard from him since the gala, not even a call or a text. It wasn't a surprise. He never did reach out unless it was absolutely necessary. It was always the same. A message only when it was too late, when everyone else had already taken their toll on me. I stared at the envelope, hesitant to open it. What did he want this time? To apologize? To try and explain everything away? Or maybe he was just trying to make himself feel better after Paige's complete erasure of me from her world. Finally, I pulled the letter from the envelope and unfolded it slowly. There was no grand apology, no lengthy explanation, just a simple line, written in his familiar neat script. I see you now. Those 5 words were all he had written, nothing more. No explanation, no attempt at reconciliation, just those 5 words. I read it again, then again. My fingers gripped the paper tightly, the words stinging in a way I didn't expect. Was it supposed to be some kind of epiphany? A grand gesture? Or was it his way of letting me know that he had finally realized the truth? That he had overlooked me for far too long? It didn't feel like an apology. It didn't feel like a breakthrough. It just felt hollow, empty. I set the letter down on the counter and stared at it, the weight of it all slowly sinking in. I wanted to feel something more. Anger, relief, maybe even closure. But instead, there was only a sense of quiet emptiness. I hadn't expected a full-on apology from him, but the lack of it left a deeper wound than I thought possible. I let out a slow breath, pushing the letter aside. I couldn't dwell on it. It was just a line, one meaningless sentence. If he truly saw me now, it would have been more than just a recognition of my existence. It would have been an acknowledgement of everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed. But that wasn't his style, was it? He didn't have the capacity to understand that, to truly see what I had been through, what I still was going through. But what surprised me most wasn't the emptiness of the letter. It was what I did next. I walked over to the trash can, my hands steady, and dropped the letter inside. I didn't linger over it. I didn't hesitate. I let it fall to the bottom, its simple message now just another piece of paper I could discard. And as the letter crumpled in the trash, I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't waiting for him anymore. I wasn't waiting for my father's approval or my sister's validation or anyone else's. The pain from Paige's dismissal still sat like a rock in my chest, but it was different now. I had already started to let go of the idea that I needed their acknowledgement to be whole. I was starting to see myself, starting to believe that maybe I mattered without their approval. Just as I sat down at my desk to collect my thoughts, my phone buzzed. It was a call from the office. West Point had reached out and requested a guest lecture. I felt a small smile tug at the corner of my lips as I answered the call. They wanted me to speak, not about war tactics or military strategy, but about leadership in silence, about visibility and the strength that came from standing firm when no one else was paying attention. I didn't need their validation. I had my own voice now, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally ready to use it. Yes, I said into the phone, my voice steady, confident. Tell them I accept. As I ended the call, I turned my attention back to the letter in the trash, still crumpled and discarded. But it wasn't just the letter that had been thrown away. It was everything I had ever done for them, everything I had sacrificed, in the hopes that they would finally see me. They hadn't, but I was done waiting for that. Now, I had something bigger to focus on, something that was mine and mine alone. And as I looked at the trash, I felt the finality of it all. The weight of their indifference was no longer a burden I had to carry. The future was mine to write. The past? That could stay where it belonged. The West Point lecture hall was packed, the rows of cadets neatly aligned, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a wave of nerves through my chest. But it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. This was different. This was my space. I wasn't just here as an observer, an outsider. I was here as someone who had lived, who had led, and who had something real to teach. As I stepped up to the podium, the room quieted, the cadets all straightening in their seats. The bright lights above cast a sharp glow on the polished wooden floor, but I wasn't focused on the space around me. I was focused on the faces in front of me. Young, eager faces who hadn't yet learned how the world could break you. But they would. They would. And when they did, I wanted them to understand what it meant to lead without visibility, to fight for what mattered when no one was watching. I cleared my throat, letting the silence hang for a moment. They were waiting for me to speak, but I needed a moment to find my ground. The world doesn't always give you what you deserve, I began, my voice steady but firm, carrying across the room. Sometimes you'll do everything right. You'll fight for everything that matters, and still, you'll be invisible. I saw a few cadets exchange glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes, but they stayed silent, hanging on to my words. I could see it already. They were used to being the ones who were seen, the ones who were praised for their excellence, their achievements, their successes. But the truth was, the world wasn't always going to acknowledge them. Not everyone would see their efforts. And that was where true leadership began. I spent years in military intelligence, I continued, walking slowly across the front of the room, the sound of my boots against the floor punctuating the silence. I led operations, coordinated missions, and worked to protect lives. I saved lives, but no one ever knew my name. I was the one behind the scenes, the one who made it happen without being seen, without being acknowledged. And in my family, I was always the afterthought, the one who kept giving, and still, no one noticed. I stopped pacing and let the words settle in. The room was still. They were listening now, really listening, and that felt good. When I first started out, I believed that if I just did my job well enough, if I just worked hard enough, someone would eventually see me. Someone would recognize what I was doing, what I was sacrificing. But they didn't, and at first it hurt, a lot. I thought maybe I wasn't good enough, maybe I wasn't doing enough. But what I've learned since then is that visibility isn't granted. It's practiced. I took a deep breath and looked out over the crowd of cadets, each of them at the beginning of their journey, each of them still believing they would rise to the top, that their hard work would be rewarded. Some would, but many wouldn't. Visibility doesn't come from waiting for someone to notice you, I said, my voice rising with a strength I hadn't felt in years. It comes from showing up, every single day. Even when no one is watching, even when you feel like you're invisible. Leadership is about standing firm in the face of that silence. It's about showing up for the people who need you, even when they don't acknowledge it, even when they don't say thank you. I could see them now, the realization dawning on their faces. Some nodded, others leaned forward slightly, hanging on every word. They weren't just hearing me, they were understanding me. They were starting to see what I was trying to teach them. When I stopped waiting for someone to acknowledge me, That's when things started to change, I said. When I finally started seeing myself for who I was, not who they wanted me to be, that's when I became the leader I needed to be. And that's when I stopped letting my family's expectations define me. It's not about their recognition. It's about your own. There was a pause, a beat of quiet as they absorbed what I was saying. I watched a few faces flicker with the same realization I had once had. That need for validation, it wasn't just going to fade, but they could learn to live without it. They could learn to lead, even when no one was watching. And that was the mark of true leadership. One cadet raised her hand, and I nodded toward her. Ma'am, what do you do when the people closest to you don't see you? What if they're the ones who've always ignored your sacrifices? I smiled softly, the answer coming to me without hesitation. Then you stop waiting for them to see you, I said. You start seeing yourself. You stop defining your worth by their approval. It won't be easy. It won't always feel fair. But you'll find that once you do, everything changes. You don't need them. You just need yourself. And when you lead from that place, from a place of self-awareness and strength, you'll see the world start to shift around you. Another hand shot up, this one from a young man sitting at the back. How do you deal with the loneliness that comes with being invisible? It's hard to keep going when no one notices. I paused for a moment thinking. The loneliness, the isolation had been one of the hardest things to overcome. But it had also been the most important. You embrace it, I said softly. You embrace the silence because it's in the silence that you find your strength. You realize that you don't need anyone else to fill the gaps. You fill them yourself. And when you do, when you stop waiting for others to complete you, you become the person you needed all along. I watched the cadets carefully, seeing the wheels turning in their minds. I could feel it, the shift. They weren't just listening anymore. They were internalizing. They were understanding. The world will try to break you down, I said, my voice growing stronger, my words more assured. They'll try to make you feel small, insignificant. But the most powerful thing you can do is stand tall anyway. And when you do, when you stand in your truth, when you lead with the certainty that no one else can define you, you'll be unstoppable. I felt the words leave me with finality, as though the lessons I had spent so long learning had finally come full circle. This was it. This was the mission I had been preparing for, not in the quiet of military operations or family gatherings, but right here, in front of them, in teaching them how to lead without recognition, how to push forward when the world refuses to acknowledge your worth. I took a step back from the podium, letting the silence stretch for just a moment. And when it finally broke, it wasn't with applause. It wasn't with the validation I had spent so long chasing. It was with something even more powerful. A room full of cadets standing in quiet respect. For once, it wasn't about what I had done for them. It was about what I had done for myself, and for the first time in years, I was okay with that. The applause, when it came, wasn't loud, it was subtle, quiet, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I didn't need the world to see me, I just needed them to hear me. And they had. And that was enough. A week after my lecture at West Point, a package arrived at my office. It wasn't unusual to receive mail, but this one felt different. Heavier somehow, more significant. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting on the package was unmistakable. It was from someone I hadn't expected to hear from, at least not in this way. I carefully tore the package open, my fingers trembling slightly, and pulled out the contents. Inside, I found a photo framed in polished wood. It was a candid shot of me standing alongside one of my cadets after the lecture, both of us smiling. The picture captured a moment of quiet pride, not a showy, exaggerated expression of success, but something more real, more grounded. The caption beneath the photo read, "For when you forget, they're looking now." I ran my fingers over the edges of the frame, the words sinking in slowly. It was the first time anyone had ever shown me a recognition like this. It wasn't about what I had given, the sacrifices, the unseen work, the years spent hidden in the background. It was about what I had become, the leader I had always been, whether anyone noticed or not. The photo wasn't about Paige, or my parents, or any of the people who had failed to see me for who I was. It wasn't about the acknowledgement I had always craved. It was about the realization that I no longer needed them to validate my existence. I set the photo on my desk beside the awards and the mission documents, carefully placing it at eye level. Not above the others, not below, but right next to them. It was equal. It was part of the story, but it wasn't the only part. There was no grand ceremony in that moment. No applause, just a quiet acceptance of what had been and what was still to come. I wasn't finished, not yet. There was still work to be done, still lessons to teach, still a life to live, still people to lead. As I sat back in my chair, I took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the moment wash over me. I felt calm. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to justify my worth. I didn't feel the weight of trying to fit into a world that had never truly accepted me. I had my own space now, my own truth, and it was enough. I reached for my draft manuscript, the one I had put aside when everything felt too overwhelming. The one I had written for myself, not for anyone else. I hadn't finished it yet, but now, as I sat there in the quiet of my office, with the photo framed beside me, I knew exactly where to begin. The first line came to me easily. It was a truth I had lived, a truth I had finally embraced. They tried to forget her. But paper remembers. I smiled faintly as I typed it out, my fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The words felt right. The manuscript felt right. This was my legacy. Not the one they had tried to write for me, not the one they had erased with their indifference. This was mine. As I hit save, the weight that had once held me down lifted. The silence around me no longer felt like a void. It was the space where I had built my own voice, my own story. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. I looked back at the framed photo. The young cadet standing beside me, her face lit up with respect, her admiration clear in the way she stood beside me. For a moment, I imagined all the others, the cadets, the people who had walked out of my life and into new spaces, who would never truly know the depth of what I had sacrificed. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that I had finally seen myself, and that was all I had ever needed to be truly free. I stood up from my desk, stretching my arms above my head, feeling the weight of years of sacrifice and invisibility fall away. The photo on my desk was a symbol of everything I had endured and everything I had become. And as I turned to leave my office, the thought lingered in my mind, clear and undeniable. The world might have tried to forget me, but I was done letting it. I had found my place, and I was finally at peace with it.